author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's edition, we are examining Donald Trump's address to Congress and what that means for the country at large. Remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us today Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for being here, Tim.
As I say, always a pleasure, Mark.
So, Tim, it's really quite an auspicious day. You and I both traipsed through the Donald Trump's speech to Congress. At time of recording, this was yesterday. And I thought, my opinion on this was, I thought it was excellent. And I know that the social media world has blown up with very divided, very contentious views on either side of that. And the media machine tends to be setting its own narrative. But what was your overall takeaway from the 1 hour 40 speech?
I could describe it, I think, in 3 words: shock and awe. But that's just my opinion. I think what's more relevant is that in a YouGov poll following
CBS YouGov poll, yes.
CBS YouGov poll, 76% liked the speech. That's an extraordinarily high number, especially in such a divided nation where the people that hate Trump hate him with such a passion to the point that we've never really seen before. I had one other reaction, which was a bit unconventional, which is that I would love to meet that 360-year-old man who's receiving Social Security, who was born before the birth of the American Republic. I mean,
that guy's got some stories to tell, right?
I actually think, though, along those lines, that of the many, many points that he made, I think it was very helpful for him to go through the millions of people who are supposedly receiving Social Security, that are in the Social Security database, who obviously are no longer alive if they ever were. Because this is one of the points that the Democrats have been trying to make to the American people. Trump is out after your Social Security. But when people see how the system is being drawn down by payments to people who don't exist, I think it makes them understand why they're going after the Social Security database, the Social Security trust fund that it draws from, supposedly, even though it's drained by Congress all the time.
Sure.
I thought that was particularly helpful.
I'd love to come back on you on that for a second, because we're not 100% positive that everybody who's on that database is claiming actual funds, but it's admitted by everybody that there is fraud within the Social Security database. And if, as the critics of DOGE say, Pete Buttigieg being one of them, saying that these are just people that are in the system, it doesn't mean they're claiming the actual funds. And my question is, well, somebody who is 200 plus years old, they weren't around. The Social Security wasn't around, so the input has also been either messed up so stupendously, which seems highly unlikely that there'd be 100,000+ people over the age of 150 years old, because that would entail some really serious data entry problems, or there is some kind of fraud taking place, because otherwise these people wouldn't be in the system, because the system didn't exist 150 years ago.
No, it didn't. It didn't even exist 100 years ago. And I think what's effective here, is what Elon Musk actually said, which is that when the government cuts a check, that's it. You can't send, for example, I have met some people who object to Social Security and they won't accept their Social Security checks, but they can't send it back to the government and have it go back into a general fund. Once a check is cut by the government, that's it. The money is spent. And it's not like a bank account where you can get a credit in return for that debit. And so I think it's emblematic of how incredibly out of control this federal bureaucracy has become, as he listed with all the absurd boondoggles that are being paid for by the federal government. And by doing that too, he is, as I wrote in a column on LibertyNation.com, he's forcing the Democrats to defend the indefensible.
Yes, it's funny to see people arguing against the idea that there should be some oversight on how things are done, because even if you don't believe that Social Security checks are being cut for cashed out for people who don't exist, obviously comedians would make the joke, we can't cut those because those are our voters. That's just what a comedian would say, of course, for all these dead people in the system. But the system is clearly broken. Otherwise, there wouldn't be all of these names in there, or people who were born 250 years ago. They wouldn't be in there if the system wasn't broken. And that brings it to another point about what DOGE has been doing is they've discovered, I think it's roughly 4 trillion, according to an interview Elon Musk did with Joe Rogan, roughly 4 trillion. It doesn't have the fields filled in on where this money went. So they can't say that it's not being wasted if they don't know where it's gone. And the fact is, it hasn't been filled in. That doesn't automatically make it criminal or fraudulent. But if we don't know where $4 trillion in funds have gone, because it hasn't put a line item name next to it, $4 trillion, they can't say definitively that that hasn't just been sent to pay for turning more mice transgender, as Donald Trump noted in his address.
Or some transgender boondoggles, or affecting school outcomes in obscure countries in Africa and Asia, a couple of which he mentioned, and he rightfully said, the president, nobody's even heard of that nation.
You're referring to Lesotho, I believe it's called, and
which I actually hadn't heard of either, even peripherally. But I think the point that he's making here is that the federal bureaucracy has no incentive to spend money responsibly. They're so distant, so removed from the average taxpayer that there's not going to be any accountability in the swamp, because nobody can pinpoint who's responsible for this expenditure or not. But Donald Trump is the first one to come along and actually treat those expenditures like it's from his own bank account. And I think this is something that is really going to change the course of history. It's going to change the course of the federal government and how it operates, because of course he'll only be in office for 4 years, but no president is going to be able to come in and follow him by saying we need to reestablish, the LGBTQ plus funding for Central American countries. Nobody's going to be able to make that statement or make that claim, because you'll notice that the Democrats do not defend a single one of these boondoggles, these illegitimate expenditures. What they do is they attack the process. That's all they can do. And once Trump revealed in his quasi-State of the Union address what some of these expenditures were, people are on board to the tune of about 3/4 of the American people are fully supportive of what the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, is doing.
We're going to continue this conversation after the short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner. Now, Tim, we've just been talking about in the first segment the impact of DOGE and how it's very difficult for Democrats to really try and defend their criticism, because and something I'd like to sort of come back to on that is you hear a lot about they're ending AIDS programs, they're ending food. I hear about these 400,000 meal packs that are parked up in New Jersey that need to go to Africa. And I think, well, first I think is, why don't they just make the meals in Africa? I'm just, that would certainly cut down on a lot. But they don't criticize the ones that are being actually exposed to the public. They're picking and choosing, and by association trying to tar everything as worthy in some way, shape, or form. And so the refusal to address the very real boondoggles that are going on, that are ideologically motivated. There's no doubt about that. And you just look through the thing, it's almost a litany of LGBTQIDEI stuff that's taking place. And these are the ones that get the headlines. That's why people are pushing them forward, rightly or wrongly. But they don't criticize those ones. They deflect to the ones that many people might see more as very worthy, and refuse to address the other ones because they know that these ones are wasteful. How do they even hope to square that circle going into another election cycle?
It's going to be even harder for them once the legitimate projects of an agency like USAID are put back in place. Things that are truly life-saving efforts, which is what USAID was established to perform. It was established to help the sick, the poor, the needy, the disabled, the people who are victims of tyranny across the world. This is what USAID was established to do. It's not an aid agency. People think that it is just an aid agency because it has AID in the name. It's actually the Agency for International Development, which is to create structures or support structures that help countries and ultimately accrue to America's benefit for spreading American, I could say largesse, but let's say American influence in a positive way around the world. A similar thing is what's going on at the southern border and the roundup of criminal aliens. Once again, the Democrats are being forced to defend the indefensible by saying that, they're going to round up our, tax-paying citizens, responsible members of the community. In fact, eventually, Tom Homan, the border czar, and ICE may begin rounding up those who are here illegally who haven't committed crimes. But so far, I guess 99% of who they're rounding up are people who have committed crimes in addition to the crime of entering the country illegally. So now they're again being forced to defend criminal aliens. And they try to say, well, they're going to round up your abuela, which is a favorite expression on the left for grandmother. They're going to rip your grandmother away from her children and grandchildren, round her up, and throw her into the back of a paddy wagon. That is not what this is about at all. So again, what Trump has done is he's front-loaded all the most popular elements of his campaign into the first 7 weeks of his presidency, knowing that if the Democrats object, they're going to be shouting into the distance for policies that are popular with the overwhelming majority of the American people, like DOGE, like closing the border, like rounding up criminal aliens. I mean, who would have thought 4 years ago that you would have a solid majority, most say about 60%, of the American public supporting mass deportations, but that's the reality of it. And it just goes to the point that I really think that Joe Biden has destroyed the Democratic Party for a decade or even a generation, because it's obvious that they're digging their heels in, they're intransigent, and they're trying to oppose things that the American people overwhelmingly desire. And that is a formula for utter disaster for one of our two major political parties.
You mentioned the overwhelming popular support, and earlier in the show we talked about the CBS News YouGov poll, and there's a couple of things to dig down into in that really apply to your point here. And I should point out that the number of Republicans within that survey were weighted at 51%, meaning that 49% were either independents or Democrats. But within that, and I don't have the numbers in front of me just now, but on waste in government spending, 77% support. In borders and immigration, also 77% support. That's huge. So that's if every Republican, if every independent, and a chunk of the Democrats there support what he's been doing on those two issues, I don't see, as you rightly say, I don't see how the Democrat Party can make a comeback if that majority of the American population actually supports what Donald Trump is doing. I've got a very short video that I'd like you to watch here, Tim, and listen to. I'm just going to hit play, and I want you to come back and let me know your thoughts on it.
Within hours of taking the oath of office, I declared a national emergency on our southern border, and I deployed the U.S. military and Border Patrol to repel the invasion of our country. And what a job they've done. As a result, illegal border crossings last month were by far the lowest ever recorded, ever.
So what do you make of that, Tim?
Well, he's willing to, Donald Trump, above all else, is willing to call a spade, so to speak, and he's willing to assign blame where it should be. And the fact that Joe Biden really opened the border, and he did it just because Donald Trump had closed it. And this shows how Trump derangement is a very real thing. It's not just some clever acronym to show people, to demonstrate just how much people hate Donald Trump. It's actually an affliction that causes people to lose their minds in many senses, or create policies that make no sense, that are abhorrent to the American people, like allowing drugs and illegal aliens across the border almost unchecked. So Trump called out Biden, he called out the Democrats for what they've done, and most Americans apparently believe that they deserved it.
Indeed. We'll be back with this conversation after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain Mark Angelides, and we continue our conversation with Liberty Nation Senior Principal Analyst Tim Donner. So, Tim, there was something very interesting, I thought, in the address to Congress, where Donald Trump said that it doesn't matter, roughly words of, it doesn't matter what I do, you're not going to like it. And that ties in with what you were just saying about TDS being a very, Trump derangement syndrome being a very real and visceral thing. So I'm just going to play you a very short excerpt here, and let me know what you think.
This is my fifth such speech to Congress. And once again, I look at the Democrats in front of me, and I realize there is absolutely nothing I can say to make them happy, or to make them stand or smile or applaud. Nothing I can do. I could find a cure to the most devastating disease, a disease that would wipe out entire nations, or announce the answers to the greatest economy in history, or the stoppage of crime to the lowest levels ever recorded. And these people sitting right here will not clap, will not stand, and certainly will not cheer for these astronomical achievements. They won't do it, no matter what. Five times I've been up here. It's very sad, and it just shouldn't be this way.
Well, I mean, in speaking to a divided nation and a party across the aisle that sat on its hands all night, and that usually happens in a State of the Union or quasi-State of the Union address, that the party opposite the president will not stand and cheer, but the degree of just visceral hatred that you could see in the eyes and the body language of the Democrats was something I've never seen before. And I've been watching these speeches for about 40 years, if not more. I've never seen the degree of animosity. And he's absolutely right. He could walk on water, and the Democrats would say Trump can't swim. That's literally what he's saying. He could cure every incurable disease, and they'd find something to pick at. And they just really disgrace themselves with their performance. They look small, they look petty, they look weak, they look rudderless, they look leaderless. And it's hard to imagine at this point, without any leadership identified in the party, Kamala Harris is certainly not going to lead the party. Joe Biden is off on the beach somewhere, and nobody else has emerged. They are still stuck, obviously, in the pro-DEI, LGBTQ plus mode. They're still defending the things that the voters so thoroughly rejected in the last election. And you can see it by the fact that their approval is at 36%, the Democratic Party, which is the lowest level since the 20th century, and probably lower than at any time since George McGovern was the far left candidate in 1972 running against Richard Nixon.
Fear and loathing on the campaign trail for anybody who like the inside track on that.
Yes, Hunter Thompson, great writer, and he did the same for campaigns after that, like in 1976 when Jimmy Carter came back. Now, you know, they could believe to themselves that a Jimmy Carter or a Bill Clinton will emerge to draw them forcefully to the center, but you don't see any kind of movement in that direction. When the Republicans were defeated, Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama in 2012, the Republicans said, look, we need to regroup. We're going to have to hold a retreat and discuss this and discuss where the party's going to go. And while that ultimately was blown up by the emergence of Donald Trump in 2015, the point is they came to grips with reality. They knew that they had lost badly, and they tried to recalibrate their message. I don't see that with the Democrats at all. Not only is the party at 36% approval, the most visible leader of the party, I guess you would say at this point, Chuck Schumer, the Senate minority leader, is at 14% approval. I mean, it is.
Is that worse than Mitch McConnell now?
I think he may have surpassed Mitch McConnell for lack of approval. But it's a dismal outlook for the Democratic Party. And until they come to grips with the reality of what the American people want and what a dismal failure the Biden administration turned out to be and how it brought the Democratic Party so low, they're going to continue to do things like wave their cane at the State of the Union address. And by the way, I'll just say that Representative Al Green of Texas disgraced the name, not just of his party, but the name Al Green, one of the great singers
the greater
of all
Al
time.
Green,
the greater Al Green, the real Al Green.
Yeah. It's funny you talk about the leadership. So there's also Hakeem Jeffries, and I'm struck by he did a video before the event that we're discussing, and he was stood in front of the Capitol building, and it was quite a wide angle shot, and he was insisting the people are with us, everyone's with us, and it was amazing because there was not one single other
Not
person
one
around.
person with it.
It's like, how can you even do that? Are you recording this at like 5:30 in the morning or something? There's nobody about, and I've never seen the Capitol with nobody about.
Well, it just shows that
Just
the
terrible
Democrats,
optics.
he's still in denial.
Yeah.
I think they would have been smarter to take the James Carville approach and, as he said, play possum.
Play
Just
possum,
pretend
yeah.
none of this is going on. Let Trump do what he is going to do, and then wait until Trump makes a mistake, which he's going to make. Every president does. Makes a mistake that they can exploit. But trying to exploit the president doing the things that the overwhelming majority of Americans desire is one of the most ineffective political strategies I've ever seen in my lifetime. The Democratic Party right now looks almost hopeless.
Yeah. I wonder if they don't, the Democratic Party don't already think that Trump has made that mistake with the recent blow up in the Oval Office against Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. But it's amazing. We talk about bad takes, Tim, and it seems to me that, and I can't quite understand it because for my sins, I assume that most people go forward with honest intentions. But we've seen since essentially Zelensky was kicked out of the White House for refusing to sign the mineral deal, which was the first step in getting an actual ceasefire, stopping people dying. And we had the entire political left, including pretty much everybody in Europe, saying that Trump's leadership is over. We need to move to Europe. And I have the words in front of me, Tim. I'd just like to read the message that Zelensky sent out on social media to you, if you don't mind. So this is Zelensky speaking now. We really do value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. We remember the moment when things changed, when President Donald Trump provided Ukraine with javelins. We are grateful for this. I'll stop quoting him just for a second, but that's precisely the words that Donald Trump used in the Oval Office. And I continue reading. Our meeting in Washington at the White House did not go the way it was supposed to go. It is regrettable that it happened this way. It's time to make things right. We would like future cooperation and communication to be constructive. Regarding the agreement on minerals and security, Ukraine is ready to sign it in any time and in any convenient format. We see this agreement as a step towards greater security and solid security guarantees. I truly hope it will work effectively. Now, does that sound to you that Vladimir Zelensky had the meeting in Washington, went off to Europe, realized that European leaders were all about trying to make themselves look like the leading light in the world, realized they're not actually going to do anything until peace is established, and then came back to Donald Trump?
Well, you'll notice during the State of the Union, people said, well, the Democrats didn't stand up even once to cheer. Actually, they did. The one thing they stood to cheer was when Trump simply noted that we'd spent hundreds of billions of dollars in Ukraine. We just sent to them sight unseen. They cheered for that. And they did not cheer for any of the touching personal stories because they considered it Trump's theatrics, whatever. Trump is above all else a master negotiator.
Yeah.
That's what the art of the deal is all about. And, Exhibit A in the art of the deal is that when you have leverage, you use it to the max. We've seen him do it in every single deal that he's made across the country and internationally. He will use the leverage of saying, look, we need to get something out of this, and you need to get some sort of alliance with us, which is exactly what they would get with the minerals deal. You'd have American boots on the ground, not military, but business and industrial boots on the ground to execute this minerals deal. It's in a form, a sense, it's a form of security guarantee for.
Putin doesn't want to bomb Americans.
But here's what I've failed to understand, because with the Democrats having become the party of war, and they have undoubtedly, the only thing they stood and cheered for was the Ukrainians. They have failed, and this is not just Democrats; it's also the neoconservatives in the Republican Party and publications like the National Review, who are acting as if we have to draw a hard line in Ukraine, where Putin is going to take over all of Europe eventually and cross the English Channel. He just doesn't have the capacity to do that.
Sure.
His military assets have been significantly diminished because of this grinding war of attrition. 1 million Russians have died. They have failed. The neoconservatives and the Democratic Party have failed to demonstrate what compelling national interest we have in Ukraine. They fail to make the case that Ukraine is indispensable to the national security of the United States, when in fact Ukraine has always been in the Russian orbit. It used to be part of the Soviet Union. You know, frankly, in most ways, you have to say, it's not our problem. It's Europe's problem. And Trump just wants to stop the killing. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. He said that over and over and over again. And the way that the left and the neoconservatives have responded is saying he's a puppet for Putin, simply because he's not going to condemn Putin before he invites him to the negotiating table. That's another pretty foundational piece of the art of the deal, is that you don't condemn either side if you want to get them to the table to negotiate an agreement.
Indeed. We're going to continue this conversation after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides and Tim Donner. Tim, so give me your view from 30,000 feet. Although maybe we shouldn't be using airplane metaphors in recent days.
Yes, I can understand that. Well, it struck me in watching the speech that Democrats now know what it's like to go to a MAGA rally. Because, of course, it was highly partisan, especially at the beginning. And, of course, none of those people would ever go near a MAGA rally. But now they get a sense of how Trump can whip people into a frenzy with his language, with his, with his soaring rhetoric, and then his pointed criticism and attacks on the people who tried to throw him in jail, bankrupt him, and of course, ultimately, there were 2 attempts to assassinate him.
Yes, not to mention the overarching goal was to stop him returning to office.
Yes.
All of these things
at any cost. And, it was said long ago, and you'll know, I think, who said it, but I'm not sure. It said, if you shoot at the king, you better not miss.
I don't know who said that, but it's a great quote.
Okay. If you shoot at the king, you better not miss. And what they've done is shoot at this particular king for the last decade, especially in the run-up to the 2024 election. And not just literally, but figuratively, they tried to shoot the king and they missed. And when you miss shooting the king, you will experience his wrath to a degree that's almost unimaginable.
Yes, they took their shot, they blew it. I mean, this in the figurative sense,
yes.
Sending him to prison or derailing his campaign. And they blew it completely. And it seems to me that they weren't prepared for that. And that's why we're seeing so much floundering now, because if that, what's the best way to put this? They started believing their own narrative. The
Yes.
people on the left, they came up with this idea that Donald Trump, he's a criminal, he's terrible, he's a quasi-fascist. And they started believing it. And they started believing what they were telling the friendly news anchors, because of course the mainstream media, the legacy media, more rightly so, weren't pushing back on their claims that Donald Trump's a threat to democracy. And so they thought there's no way he can win. And then he won. And then he's doing everything that he said he was going to do in the campaign. And they didn't expect those two things. One, they didn't expect him to actually win. Two, they didn't expect him to do what he said he was going to do. And that's political naivety of the most egregious kind, Tim.
Yes, they said to themselves, of course, the country isn't going to elect this guy again. And I think, frankly, Mark, January 6th of 21 had quite a bit to do with it. They figured that they could just play the January 6th footage in a loop, and that would be enough to horrify the American people. But just to make sure, they would trump up charges in 4 different legal venues to try and throw him into jail. People could see that the charges were trumped up, unprecedented use of legal maneuvers to make something reasonably innocent seem like it was felonious. And, they did that just to be sure. And every time they piled on, whether it was the case in New York or in Georgia or from Jack Smith at the federal level, they just worsened their case, and they made Trump that much more a subject of, if not empathy, at least sympathy from people, American people who would ordinarily not have been sympathetic towards him, but saw the basic unfairness of the whole thing. And then, of course, there's the results of the Biden administration. And once you had a head-to-head comparison between what Trump actually did as president and what Biden and Harris actually did as president, the choice was not hard for the American people.
I think it comes down to one thing. America was, as a nation, was born as the underdog against essentially the greatest power the world had known at that time, against Britain. And it
Still
was
sorry about that, Mark. Sorry about that.
We will let you go.
148 years ago.
So America was born as an underdog. And America loves that story. They love the underdog story. And what they managed to do by prosecuting him, by demonizing him, in every venue possible, they took the guy who was president of the United States and they made him the underdog against Kamala Harris. And I think that was what cost them. Final word on that, Tim, from you.
Well, I think I'll go back to what you said. They started to believe their own headlines. They started to believe, because of the reinforcement of mass media, that Trump was a threat to democracy without actually describing in what way he was. They still are doing that. In the Elisa Slotkin response to the State of the Union, she talked again about democracy and the threat to democracy, and it's so important. But she really was empty rhetoric. And right now, while Trump has done more in 7 weeks than Joe Biden probably did in a lifetime, and certainly in 4 years in the Oval Office, the Democrats appear to be clueless and not knowing what to do or how to respond. There's a gulf of America between the Republicans and Democrats right now.
And may it be named forever so. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for today on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guest, longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner. And of course, thank you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in each week and join us for the show. Please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.